Well, I'm afraid we're going to hear more of the same. I think the president's going to say one set of things, but then we're going to see the truth be something different. So, for example, I think he'll talk about inflation being down when, in fact, what we see is inflation has been up dramatically during his term. Working Americans have seen their real wages decline during these last 2 years. You know, if I said to most Americans, would you give up a month of your pay? Most Americans couldn't afford to do that. And yet, that's what inflation has done to them. You consider the inflation rate of the last 2 years. Most Americans have been forced to give up 1 month's pay during the time President Biden has been in office. So I think we'll hear that. I think we'll hear him talk about gas prices being down when, in fact, since he's been in office, they've been up.
New polling is out showing that most Democrats don't want President Biden to run for re-election in 2024. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't. You know, this president didn't really get vetted when he ran in 2020. He stayed in his basement through most of that campaign. Unfortunately, the media didn't force him out. And so I think Americans got something different than what they expected. And I think they've seen that on display for the last 2 years. I think they're terribly disappointed in the policies that this administration has put forward. The president talked a lot about bringing America back together, but in fact, his policies have been as divisive as any in the history of this country.
So you mentioned inflation. We're also seeing issues at the border. How do you see these issues continuing to be a problem for him during this term?
Well, so we saw the president here recently in response to pressure from the new Republican majority in the House for the first time in his life go to the southern border. And I think even then we saw a less than serious approach by the president to the reality that's happening at the southern border. I think there's a game that's being played there. The president telegraphed this as a candidate, saying that we could take millions more Americans. We've now seen almost 6 million illegal immigrants come into the country in just 2 short years. It's really unprecedented, and I think this is a game that the Democratic Party and the president is playing to try and stack the deck for the future in terms of the population of this country and apportionment representation in the Congress.
Republicans obviously have control of the House. Democrats still have the Senate and the White House. How do you see bipartisanship coming into play here?
Well, I think we stand ready to work with Democrats in the Senate and in the administration to try to arrive at policies that will move the country back in the right direction. The question is, will the president come to the negotiating table? Will the Senate take up the legislation that House Republicans send, in some cases bipartisan congressional House action? Will the Senate take those matters up and help us move the country in the right direction? In some cases, they will have to come to the negotiating table, in the case of the debt ceiling, for example. And so we're just going to have to fight kind of every inch of the way to make sure that we do what the American people wanted us to do when they gave Republicans a majority in this House of Representatives.
So what are you expecting out of President Biden's speech tomorrow night?
Well, I think President Biden is going to be making a lot of excuses to the American people, but what he should be doing is apologizing. Number one, he should be apologizing for the debacle and the embarrassment that we endured last week from the Chinese spy balloon that President Biden and his administration allowed to traverse across the entire country before leaving North Carolina and then shooting it down. He needs to realize how Americans feel about that. The American people are so upset. No one knew if that Chinese spy balloon carried a virus, another bioweapon. We have no idea if it carried a nuclear bomb. We don't know if it could have delivered an EMP attack